Hi folks, Matt Easton here, scholagladiatoria. So here's a rare thing that you don't see on my channel very often, and that's me holding a modern fencing weapon. This was the épée that I used to fence with about 10 years ago, and it's an electric modern épée, nothing really to remark about it. But what I want to say in this video is that basically is to outline and describe one of the important differences between modern Olympic style fencing, so modern fencing swords, particularly sabres we're going to look at, but I'm going to briefly mention épées and foils at the beginning here, and the historical counterparts. Now, the first thing I want to say about épées and foils, and it's the only thing really that I'm going to say about them here, this is really more about sabres, is please stop referring to these as rapiers. The sword behind me here is a rapier. Now, I have spoken about this before, and that's why I'm only going to speak about this briefly here, but that is a rapier. Yes, indeed, this is a swept hilt rapier in the English style from about 1630, 1640, so around the time of the English Civil War. This is more or less based on an example in the Wallace collection, and this was made by Dinelli Armories, Marco Dinelli. And now you will hopefully, at first sight, certainly let's put the épée down for a second, see that there is a vast difference between the rapier and the foil. Now the foil, as I've spoken about many times previously, was the practice weapon for the small sword, okay, not the rapier. Now, admittedly, the small sword did evolve out of late transitional period rapiers. But this is a very, very light weapon. It is a thrust-only weapon. There are no cuts allowed in foil fencing, despite what you see randomly in some movies. I was watching a movie the other day where someone was cutting with a foil, most bizarre. This is a very, very different weapon to the rapier. The rapier is obviously it's a cut and thrust sword. You can cut things with rapiers. Not badly. I mean, they're not the best cutters in the world, but they do have quite a fair amount of cutting capacity because they're fairly heavy and they're fairly big and they're fairly long. And this example, which is matching the one in the Wallace collection, is just under 1,300 grams, so 1.3 kilograms, or about 12, maybe 1250 grams actually. And the foil is very, very much lighter. It's something like 300 grams, something like that. So it's very, very light. Now the épée, some people go, oh, well, the épée is the practice version of the rapier. No, it's not. The épée was basically the practice weapon for the épée. The épée de combat, as it was known, or épée de combat if you were writing it in English, and that is simply a sharp épée. And they were simply an evolution of the small sword in the 19th century. So in the 19th century, people had ceased dueling with small swords, and they invented something instead called the épée de combat, which is really just a type of small sword with a bigger bowl guard, or it evolved a bigger bowl guard. It didn't initially have one. It initially had a smaller guard the size of the foil. And yes, they're a little bit heavier. They've got a bigger guard, but they are thrust-only weapons, triangular section blades, pointy at the end, only for thrusting. One of the reasons that you have a first to touch rule in épée, which you don't have in small sword. So the right of way rule in small sword is basically a way of training people to fence more safely, less suicidally. But the reason you've got a first touch rule in épée is that it's a first blood duel with the épée de combat. Okay, so that's very, very simplified, very condensed. There is a lot more detail to this topic. But just to say that the épée and the small sword are both fencing versions, practice versions of sharp dueling weapons of the 18th and 19th century. They are not anything like a rapier, really, so please stop calling them rapiers. This is a rapier. Right, now we're going to look at sabres. So I have here, I won't call it a modern, although it is sort of modern to me, to my collecting habits. This is I think it's actually Leon Paul, vintage fencing sabre. And in kind of weight and balance and everything else, it's very similar to modern sabres. There are some differences of the material, but it's basically a triangular section blade with a back, hollow ground back, and then a sort of edge at the front. You can cut and thrust with these, and this weighs 380 grams, which is not unusual at all by modern sabre standards. Most modern fencing sabres weigh 300 to 400 grams. I believe that in the rules they can be up to 500 grams, but I don't think anyone uses ones of that weight in general speaking. Now, you can of course construct them of different parts. You can have different types of blades, slightly stiffer, slightly more flexible, slightly heavier, slightly lighter. You can have slightly different guards, you can have slightly different poles and slightly different grips, of course. But fundamentally, this is fairly typical of the sort of fencing sabre that has been used since about the 1930s, 40s. Okay, they haven't changed an awful lot. They've changed a bit in stiffness and this kind of stuff. So this is a modern fencing sabre, and you can see that you can move it incredibly quickly. Now, what's interesting is when we're looking at so-called gymnasium sabres or practice sabres from the end of the 19th century and beginning of the 20th century, of which this is an example. This is a Masiello type Italian style fencing sabre. They often get compared with the modern Olympic sabre, and indeed this is pretty much did develop from this, but there are some pretty big critical differences. Now, this is a move away from the type of gymnasium sabres that we tend to use because we're looking at earlier 19th century stuff. So this is from the end of the 19th century, 1890s, well, debatably 80s, 1880s onwards. And this type of lighter practice sabre starts to gain popularity in the second half of the 19th century, particularly in Italy, but also to some extent in some French schools, and also perhaps some others, perhaps Hungarian as well. But this particular style is fundamentally an Italian style. It was used by similar ones were used by Rodelli, although he has a different style hilt. Masiello, Parise kind of had slightly more simplified style. But basically these are Italian practice sabres. Now, these are what gave rise more or less to the modern fencing sabre, but there, as I say, there are some big differences in the handling. As you can probably see, the modern, in parentheses, the modern or narrower blade is thinner, much thinner and much lighter. As I said, this weighs 380 grams. This particular example is actually the lightest of the military gymnasium sabres I have, and linked below here is an article where I have a bunch of British, some of them are Italian style, but a bunch of British gymnasium sabres of the end of the 19th century and beginning of the 20th century, and you can see their statistics, length of blade, point of balance and weight there. And you will see that even this lightest one I have is 600 and something grams. So this is not quite twice, but going in that direction, the mass of this. But more importantly than that, not only is this twice, or let's say kind of 80% more the mass of this, but that mass, very importantly, is mostly in the blade. Now that makes a very, very big difference, because it means that if we look at the points of balance, so this one does balance fairly close to the hilt. There we go, so about 2 inches away from the hilt. Again, the statistics are on my website linked below. And in fact, the modern sports sabre is about the same point of balance, but we have to consider weight distribution. Okay, so we don't only look at total weight by itself and point of balance, we also want to know where is that mass particularly distributed, because I could have a lot of mass here and here, and I'd have almost none at the tip, and that would make, as I've got here, for an incredibly fast and whippy tip. Okay, there are very few cutting swords that you could move as fast as that. Whereas if I switch to this, I can still move it pretty quickly, but not as quickly. Okay, now I mentioned this was the lightest one I've got. This one's 600 grams. If I now switch to the British military one, which you'll see is a very similar design, you might just think, oh, the only difference is one has some perforations in the hilt. Very similar design. Yes, very different weight though. This weighs over 800 grams. So at over 800 grams, this is more than twice the weight of the modern fencing sabre, and that's as fast as I can move that one. Okay, so it's still a pretty nimble and quick sword. You can still move it around very nicely and quickly and deftly, but you can't reload a cut as quickly as you can with the sports sabre. Okay, you can move this at amazing speed because of weight distribution and weight mass placement. So quite simply, as well as having a much heavier blade in percentage terms, a lot more mass is in the tip of the blade up here compared to the modern sports sabre. Now, what's the point of me saying this? Really just to say, so it's not really, I'm not trying to undermine or criticise modern sports sabre fencing. In fact, I often get people in my historical fencing club, so I have a background in sports sabre, I did sports sabre at university, and I often get people come to my club, scholagladiatoria, and with a modern sabre background, and they pick up military sabre very quickly, because fundamentally the technique's not the same, but it's very, very close. And if you've got fundamentals in modern Olympic sabre, you can really, really quickly and easily transfer that. And it's true of épée and foil to some degree as well, but you can very quickly transfer that to historical weapons like these, or sabres. With some changes, and the main changes, as I've tried to express in previous videos, is actually to do with the rules and the mindset. If you can change how you play the rules and how you change the mindset, then you'll have no problems at all. The timing and the distance is, transferable skills perfectly. But in terms of the way that the sabre moves and what it takes to deliver a cut, you just simply can't do these sorts of movements with even the lightest. I mean, I can do that, but it's way more fatiguing and quite a bit slower. Maybe only 60% of the speed, and much, much more fatiguing on my arm. So the weapon really does change quite a lot. And I think it would be interesting and possibly lead to better form if modern sabre fencing did switch to slightly heavier blades. I know I believe they've switched to stiffer blades because of people doing these flick over things, and also because of modern electric scoring. The edge isn't the only thing which you can score with now. You can hit with the flat, which means you can get angles of hit that you couldn't get if you were using the edge, because of course the wrist can bend in directions with the flat that you can't bend it with the edge. But nevertheless, those are details for modern fencers to argue about. But really just to highlight that the mass difference between this 380 grams and this 800 and something grams, it's not only about the mass increase, it's about where the mass is. So although this is twice as heavy as this, in some ways it feels even more, because the mass is all in the second half of the blade, where inertia means that it takes the most effort to move. And we're obliged to cut in a way that would actually cut. We have to cut with the edge, and we have to cut and make a cut that would actually cut something. Not just lay the edge on, and not just a tiny flick, although in fairness, with a weapon this light, you can actually get quite a hard hit with a tiny flick, because you've got so little mass in the second half of the blade to suddenly accelerate. Anyway, there we go. So hopefully this is kind of, for some people who don't necessarily know about these comparisons, I'm sure lots of you do know, hopefully this will clear a few things up. Foils and épées are not rapiers, they are not practice weapons for rapiers. They're practice weapons for small swords and épée de combat, point-only dueling swords. And modern fencing sabres move very, very differently to historical sabres, even the lightest of the military gymnasium sabres, despite the fact they're related and they developed within about a 20-year period of each other. They move very, very differently to each other. But that being said, if you can't get to a HEMA club, do modern Olympic fencing. And I always tell people that. It's certainly if you want to do sabre or rapier or a one-handed weapon that most of the time has the lead side of the body forward. If you want to do one of these fencing styles, even side sword debatably, although that's obviously passing footwork's a very different footwork, but any one-handed sword, if you do some modern fencing, if you can't get to a HEMA club, that is only going to put you in good stead if you do want to transfer to HEMA or do HEMA additionally in the future. And some of the best fencers that we have in the HEMA world have a modern fencing background. And lots of us who focus on things like sabres like me, have done modern fencing in the background. I've done full sabre and épée. Anyway, thank you for watching. I'll see you again soon on scholagladiatoria channel. Take care and give us a like and a subscribe. Cheers, folks. Thanks for watching. We've got extra videos on Patreon. Please give our Facebook a like and subscribe if you haven't already. Cheers, folks.